Well, hello and welcome. My name is Karen and this is Alex.
Hi.
And together we lead Sheffield Vineyard Church. And you are just so welcome. We're really happy that you could join us as we worship together this morning.
Yeah, we like to call this Very Good Sunday. I mean, if Jesus died on Good Friday, then today is very good, because today it's the day that Christians all over the world remember and rejoice in the resurrection of Jesus.
All of life, all of history, all of our future, whether we know it or not, points toward the moment when Jesus rose from the dead. The death and the resurrection of Jesus change everything for everyone, all of the time. And
when the church was first formed in the wake of Jesus' coming in human form to earth, it was the leaders of the church and the centre of every single talk that they gave where we find the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
So we're going to begin this morning with a time of worship, just as we do week in, week out. We love to worship. And then there's going to be a short talk, which is going to centre around Jesus' resurrection. And then we're going to ask everyone who's watching live to move across to Zoom and join us as a church family. We share together in communion.
And look, don't worry if you don't have a bottle of red wine next to you at the breakfast table. In fact, if you do have a bottle of red wine next to you at the breakfast table, then you probably should worry. Look, you can use milk and crackers if that's what you've got to hand. It actually doesn't matter what vintage of wine or type of bread we use. What really matters is that we take a moment to remember and rejoice in what Jesus has done.
So as we begin to worship this morning, what we want to do is focus on Jesus. Focus on who he is and what he's done for each one of us. So before the worship team come and join us, we're going to watch a mini movie. It's based around the verse from John chapter 3, verse 16. It's a very well-known verse in the Bible, but it captures in just one single sentence the truth and the significance of the resurrection of Jesus. So as we begin, let's just quieten our minds. Let's just still our hearts as we prepare to meet with Jesus this morning. We say, "Come, Holy Spirit." We welcome your presence. Come and move amongst us as we worship, as we learn, as we engage with you. Come, Lord Jesus.
Amen.
The gospel accounts of Jesus, they concentrate on the last years of his life. When Jesus was in his early 30s, he took up the position of a rabbi. He taught publicly, he began teaching from the Holy Scriptures and prophesying about what was to come. But his core message was very different to that of most of the other rabbis. Jesus' message was one where the poor were made noble, and sinners and failures in life received mercy, forgiveness and love. Jesus picked up the same Old Testament scriptures that many other people were talking through, but he exposed a truth that had been hidden from the ears of the crowds. Jesus said that the God of the scriptures, his God, his Father, was a God of tenderness, one who touches and heals and embraces, and who forgives those who least deserve it, but who truly desire it.
But perhaps the most amazing thing about Jesus' ministry was that he demonstrated what he was saying through his own life. People were stunned because Jesus showed honour and dignity to people who were shunned in society, and because he had a deep compassion for those in need. And that compassion drove him to associate himself with reprobates and people who had incurable infectious diseases, who were considered to have deserved those conditions because of some secret sin. And he started to grab supernatural powers from heaven and distribute these powers on earth through miracles and wonders. And he went around healing people from their afflictions, be it physical or emotional or spiritual. And he took command over natural and unnatural forces. He walked on water, he fed thousands of people with a single lunchbox, and we could go on forever talking about the most amazing things that he's done.
Jesus talked about what life was meant to be like according to God's original design. But then he acted with the power and the authority of God, restoring lives one by one. And Jesus' miracles, they're not interruptions in an otherwise natural order, but they bring order to our current disordered life. Our current way of life is in fact the interruption of God's design for life. So Jesus went from town to town proclaiming the coming of a new world order. He claimed that his arrival marked the coming of a new kingdom reign, the one that was spoken about by the prophets in the Old Testament.
Now, not unsurprisingly, Jesus grew in notoriety. People were attracted to him because, well, not just because of his message, but also because of his authenticity. He practiced what he preached. And many Jews started to think that Jesus was the Messiah, someone who they had been expecting would show up at some point to save them from Roman dictatorship and bring a new kingdom rule and reign. And to some extent, well, they were right, but they kind of had a wonky understanding as to what God's kingdom rule and reign was actually like. And they didn't really quite understand how he would overthrow the current Roman power base.
Others, more often than not the Jewish leaders, saw Jesus as a threat to the position of dominance and power they had in Jewish culture. They expected that when God's kingdom came crashing down onto earth, that they would be raised up into prominent positions. So when they heard Jesus talking about God's kingdom belonging to the poor and the destitute, and those people in power, they began to resent that message. They resented what Jesus was saying, and they resented Jesus.
And their hatred for Jesus intensified when Jesus arrived at Jerusalem and overturned a marketplace that had been set up in the temple. Jesus made it very clear his disdain for the way that Jewish leaders had turned the process of giving sacrifices to God into an enterprise that lined the pockets of the rich and powerful. And Jesus called the Jewish leaders a gang of rebels, and he accused them of actually opposing what God is really all about. His speech was like that of Jeremiah, who many years previously stood on the very same spot and told the religious leaders that they were all corrupt. And so Jewish leaders who were standing around at the time, they got the message, and they started to plan for Jesus' arrest and hopefully his death.
And as all this was beginning to happen, the people of the time, the Jewish people, were preparing for an annual festival called a Passover. And this festival, the Passover, they would celebrate that every year. And it was an opportunity to recall the time when God had saved the Israelites from the Egyptian oppression. And during the Passover, there were 2 ingredients used. And Jesus took these 2 and he applied them to himself. As he was sat with the disciples as part of the celebration, he took some bread and he said to them, "This bread, this is my body that will be broken for you." And a little later on in the same meal, he took some wine and he said, "This wine represents my blood." Now that was the wine used in the Passover that was a reminder of the blood that had adorned the doorways of all the Israelite houses, which had enabled the spirit of death to pass over and those people back then to be saved. And Jesus is saying, this blood, this is my blood. So effectively here what Jesus is saying to his disciples is that it's God who saves us. And Jesus not only knew what was going to happen to him, and you could say maybe his death was predictable given the gang of rebels that were gathering, but that he actually knew the significance of what was to come.
That's right. And so after the meal, Jesus goes to a local woodland and he prays. And he struggles with his natural desire of not wanting to die an agonizing death and be separated from his Father as he takes upon the sin of the world. But at the same time, he considers his love for us, coupled with his desire to follow his Father's will, that allowed him to choose death so that we could choose to live in him. And it's here that the Jewish leaders find him, and they're accompanied by some Roman guards who have come to arrest him. And it's really necessary for the Roman guards to make that arrest because in those times the Jewish leaders had no authority to execute anyone. I mean, the Jews were subject to the authority of the Roman Empire, and a death sentence could only be handed out by a local Roman governor, a man named Pontius Pilate.
So the Jewish leaders, they gathered, together with the Roman soldiers, they got him and they brought Jesus before Pilate, and they accused him of being a rebel king. And even though Pilate he couldn't fathom, he couldn't pin any crime on Jesus, even though he couldn't, because he was so fearful of the social uprising, he agreed to release an actual rebel, a man who was named Barabbas, and he agreed to release Barabbas to the crowd instead of Jesus. And so Jesus, an innocent man, takes on the punishment of a guilty man. And from that point on, Jesus was beaten, he was taken out from the city, and he went on to be crucified along with two criminals.
Now, a religious leader called Joseph, he then requested that he take the body, Jesus' dead body, and he placed the corpse in a tomb that he had reserved for himself. A couple of days later, some women who had known Jesus came to attend to Jesus' body. When they arrived, they found that the stone that had once sealed the tomb had been rolled to one side and it was empty. And then they saw this mysterious person who informed them that Jesus was alive. Were confused, overwhelmed, perhaps remembering what Jesus had previously talked about rising from the dead. They ran to the house where Jesus' disciples were hiding and they tell them everything that they've just seen.
And later, Jesus actually shows up in that house. Can you imagine what it must have been like? He stood there, people are poking their fingers in the holes in his hand, and he begins eating with them, and he doesn't look like he's just recently been crucified. He's walking around. He starts to go into the local area. He's meeting other people. Crowds are gathering. And as word gets out, more and more people are arriving to see him. And Jesus starts to talk about the power that he's been given to overcome death. And he explains that that very same power is on offer to everyone so that no one needs to ultimately die. And then Jesus ascends to heaven, the Holy Spirit comes, and Peter, one of the disciples, gives the first ever church sermon, and thousands of people start to believe and to follow the teachings of Jesus.
That Jesus rose from the dead, that's the fulcrum of the Christian belief. All of Christianity rests on the resurrection of Jesus. If he didn't rise from the dead, millions of people have wasted their time and energy following what is at best a wholesome moral framework, but fundamentally a lie. However, if Jesus did rise from the dead, then millions of people who have not stopped to consider the fact are missing out on a much better life, and ultimately missing out on an eternity with God himself.
So we're faced with two questions, and perhaps they're the biggest two questions that anyone can ever face. The first is the resurrection of Jesus true? Did it actually happen? And the second is, if it is, then what does that mean? What does it mean for us? So we're going to tackle this first question first. Is the resurrection of Jesus actually true? Did Jesus actually come back to life?
Well, any person who doesn't believe that there is in existence a God with authority over death, well, they would say no. But if that person were a rational thinking person and someone who subjects themselves to proper scientific inquiry, then they would have to consider all the evidence, even the evidence that would contradict their own opinion. Otherwise, their view would be predicated on a religious outlook rather than hard evidence. And so, what's the evidence that supports the view that Jesus rose from the dead?
Well, firstly, no one was expecting him to rise from the dead, not even his closest followers. It was a surprise to everyone. Yet people still claimed it happened. Before Jesus died, he said he would rise from the dead 3 days after death. He said so multiple times. There are records of this in chapters 8, 9 and 10 of Mark's Gospel. So you could ask, why weren't the disciples queuing up at the tomb at the end of day 2, right there waiting to see what would happen?
You see, the resurrection was inconceivable for the first disciples and the people closest to Jesus. It was just as implausible to believe then as it is for many to believe today. Greeks of the time, they didn't believe that people would come back to life after they died. Some Jews did, but only in the context of a whole new world. They didn't, and they still don't believe that individuals would rise from the dead. The people of Jesus' day were not predisposed to believe in the resurrection any more than we are.
First people who claimed that Jesus was alive were not lacking intelligence. Regarding resurrection, they believed what many non-Christians today believe, that it's just not possible. Yet thousands of them then went on to claim that they'd seen Jesus alive in the weeks after his death. So our first piece of evidence that Jesus rose from the dead is that people said that he rose, that they claimed that he was alive, and that this claim was every bit as unexpected for them as it would be today.
A second piece of evidence relates to the sheer number of people who claimed that they saw Jesus alive very soon after he had died. Now, it could be argued that perhaps Jesus didn't actually die, that somehow his body manages to keep alive, preserved in the cool of the tomb. It could be argued that despite being beaten up so badly that he was unrecognisable to his own family and then left to hang on a cross and pierced with a spear, that over time he healed, and against all the odds he hung on to life. I mean, that's really unlikely, but perhaps there's the slightest chance that it actually happened. But that Jesus was seen a couple of days later walking around as though he'd suffered little more than falling off his bike and scraping his hands, that's something else.
Yet the number of people who claim to have seen the risen Jesus in bodily form, walking around well and quite normally after his death, ran into hundreds and thousands. And these weren't just the people who'd followed him. This wasn't just his disciples and the people who knew and loved him before he died. Actually, these people, some of them were typical Greeks. Others were Jewish, non-Jesus followers.
Paul, in one of his letters, says that 500 people saw Jesus alive at one time. Paul also said that it was at his time of writing that most of the people who had seen Jesus were still alive. In other words, if Paul were making it all up, these people who were still alive would be denying the fake news. But they didn't. They risked death themselves and openly agreed with Paul's account.
So our second piece of evidence concerns the number of people who claim to have seen Jesus after his death. We could expect to hear of the odd fanatic, making such a claim, but hundreds, thousands of people all saying the same thing. That just can't be ignored.
Thirdly, claiming that Jesus was alive was dangerous. There's no good reason why people would want to claim that Jesus was alive after he'd just died. And there's one very good reason why no one would want to claim that at all. I mean, the people who had just crucified Jesus hadn't gone anywhere, and they hadn't changed their zeal to eradicate the idea that Jesus was the Messiah, some kind of a king, God himself in human form.
I guess at best anyone suggesting they'd met someone who died by crucifixion, who'd been buried but then had been seen alive again, wandering about completely fine, would simply have been called an idiot. But, at worst, someone making that claim may go on to suffer the same fate as Jesus. People would only declare that they'd seen Jesus alive if they were absolutely certain, if they were completely convinced, because their declaration ran the high risk of them being outcast from society or even killed.
And so our third piece of evidence is that even if people were suddenly prepared to believe in something that they previously regarded as ridiculous, lots of people claiming that Jesus had risen from the dead was like putting a target on themselves. They ran the risk of receiving the very same treatment that Jesus endured for aligning themselves with his message.
But I guess the fourth piece of evidence that Jesus rose from the dead is perhaps the most compelling. It's the evidence that can be seen in the way people's lives changed after they heard, saw, and believed in the resurrection of Jesus. Immediately after the death of Jesus, his disciples, they ran and they hid in a teeny room. They were terrified that the same people who'd killed Jesus would come and find them and kill them too. But after they met the risen Jesus, when they'd seen for themselves Jesus in his new physical body, when they'd poked their fingers through the holes in his hands, then they believed. And they went out and they began to tell people the gospel of Jesus. They lived radically different lives, sharing their possessions, caring for the vulnerable, worshipping and doing life as a community of believers together.
The resurrection of Jesus changes people's lives. It still does. The rational evidence that points to the resurrection of Jesus is compelling. But there are limits of knowing God on a purely academic level. And so for me, it's the personal grasping of the life of Jesus it's hard to communicate, but it's so certain in my heart.
And I guess this leads to our second question, which we can cover relatively quickly, is, if it is true that Jesus is alive today, then what does it mean? What does it mean for us? And let's consider what motivated Jesus to endure the cross. In Hebrews 12, verse 2, it says this. It says that Jesus is the founder and perfecter of faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. It tells us that it was joy that motivated Jesus to die.
In Dane Ortland's recently published book, it's this one here, it's called Gentle and Lowly, which I recommend you all to read. It says this, it says, It was the joyous anticipation of seeing his people made invincibly clean that sent him through his arrest, death, burial and resurrection. When we today partake in the atoning work, coming to Christ for forgiveness, communing with him despite our sinfulness, we're laying hold of Christ's own deepest longing and joy.
When Jesus considers the person who drove that spear through his side, he sees us. He sees you and he sees me. Jesus longs for us to understand the pain and the suffering that he endured during his death on the cross is nothing in comparison to the pain and the suffering which he experiences when we reject his forgiveness and love. Through Jesus' death and his resurrection, we can be healed, forgiven, and brought back into a right relationship with him.
The resurrection of Jesus changes everything. It's the key to unlock full life for every person. Jesus knew that his death and his resurrection would have eternal, irrevocable, and universal effects. And as Jesus hung on the cross, he could have at any moment lifted himself off. He could have amazed the crowds and cut short his own pain. But it was the knowledge that people would become believers through his actions that drove him to choose to stay till the very end. And that's why that Bible verse says this. It says, Jesus is called the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross.
So what does his resurrection mean for us? Well, it means everything, and it means everything to everybody, all of the time. And it means we need to do nothing except believe that God has already done everything to enable everyone to have an eternal and glorious relationship with him. It means we need to live our lives as a response to what Jesus has already given to us. We reciprocate his love as we follow in his ways, not as a means to receive from him, but as a way to respond to the grace which he has already shown us. So we receive him by faith, but we respond to him by following in his ways and doing the things that he is calling us to do.
And so now we're going to respond in faith and in action by taking communion together. And we're going to do this using Zoom. Now, for those of you who are watching live, there's going to come up on the screen a link to the Zoom room. Please, 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 we'd love you to join us. The link is also shown on the Facebook feed, and it's on the main page of the Sheffield Vineyard website.
You know, we hope you'll move straight across and we can spend a few minutes together just taking communion in our individual homes. If you don't, then we just hope that you have an amazing day today, that you recognise today as a special day and you really enjoy celebrating with your current household and with your family and your friends outdoors. And please, if you can, come and join us in person this afternoon at 3 p.m. We're going to be in the Birkdale School Gardens for a short outdoor open air Easter celebration. Again, the details are all on the website, but you would be so welcome to come and to be there.
And also don't forget about Peaks and Pub Walk tomorrow. It's not quite in the Peaks and it's definitely not in a pub. Nevertheless, it's going to be a wonderful walk and you're invited to come along. You do need to sign up. Just the way that we managed it in a safe way means you need to sign up. So please go to peaksandpub.org. And we'll see you shortly on Zoom. Thanks very much.
See you soon.